G'day, Dave here, and we're looking at Psalm 15. And this is a psalm of David, and he begins by asking two of the most important questions you could ever ask. It might not seem that way at first glance. Let's have a look and hear what he has to say. Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? This is the first of those important questions. Who may dwell in your sacred tent? Now, the sacred tent for David would have been the tabernacle. It was a tent that was kind of like the temple, but it was movable. Before they had a temple established in the city of Jerusalem, God provided them with a special tent that had a special place where God would meet with the high priest. And it was seen as the place of God's presence. In fact, no one was allowed to come into the very center of this place except for the high priest. So he's asking the question, who is fit to really come into the presence of God? It's a question for David, but it's a question for all of us. Who is able to come to God and come into his very presence? And the second question that he asks is, it's really the same question, but it's asked differently. Who may live on your holy mountain? Mount Zion was considered to be the place where God specially dwelt. It was the place of his refuge, the place of his kingdom, the place where God would set up his throne and where people could dwell in peace and security forever. And David's asking these questions. Who can come into God's presence? Who can be safe with God and know that they're right with God forever and ever? They're important questions. They were then and they are today. Can you come into the very presence of God? What do you have to do? What sort of person do you have to be suitable to be with God? Well, he goes on to answer this question in verses 2 to 5, and then he gives a promise at the very end. And if you look at the end of this psalm in it's the end of verse 5, whoever does these things will never be shaken. That is, if you want security of being in a right relationship with God, if you want to be able to come into God's very presence and have God protect you, then the one who does these things qualifies. So we need to look at these. These are important verses, verses 2 through to 5, to see what it is that God expects if people are going to be qualified to come into his presence and to be with him in security for all eternity. Well, let's read through verses 2 to 5. The one whose walk is blameless, the one who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbour and casts no slur on others, who despises a vile person but honours those who fear the Lord, who keeps an oath even when it hurts and does not change their mind, who lends money to the poor without interest, who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. Well, we'll look at each of these in a little bit of detail, but let me say first of all, did you notice there was nothing particularly religious about these requirements? There were no ceremonies, there's no rituals, there's no offering of sacrifice, there's no going to the temple, there's no religious performance, no church going, no praying, no Bible study, none of these things that we might expect would qualify us to live in the presence of God. This is quite ordinary. This has got to do with character and integrity and the way we speak and the way we treat other people. It's really got to do with life lived well in relationship with others. Well, let's have a look at each one and see how we go. The one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbour and casts no slur on others. See, here's a man who is living with a character that is blameless. He's a man of integrity and honesty. The way he lives is the way that he speaks. His words match his life, and his life matches his words. And he treats other people well. He doesn't slander people. He doesn't put people down. Doesn't speak behind people's back and gossip at the office. Now, here is a person who is genuine. They're kind of a salt of the earth type of person. Somebody that you can't accuse of doing wrong. Somebody who is upright. And isn't this the kind of person you'd want to vote for in an election? Isn't this the kind of person that you would want to follow in life? Well, it's the person who has a good character, they're a person of integrity, they speak the truth, and they don't use their words to cut other people down. But they do have a concern for truth and for character and for behaviour. And we see this in verse 4 and following. Who despises a vile person. That is, they won't tolerate wickedness. If people are putting others down, if people are living in a way which is ruthless and cruel, if people are living in a way which is fit for the gutter, they're not happy with that. But alternatively, they do honour those who fear the Lord. There's something right about those who treat God as God. They actually acknowledge that and live that out. Who keep an oath even when it hurts and don't change their mind. They're reliable, they're trustworthy, they're faithful people. That is, their word is their bond. They make a statement, they keep their promise. And who lend money to the poor without interest. That is, they're not looking to get rich at the expense of others. They genuinely see need and they're generous in meeting that need. And who do not accept a bribe against the innocent. That is, they won't be corrupted. They will do what's right, even when it costs them. Now, friends, here's a picture. I don't think it's meant to be a definitive picture. It doesn't cover every area of life, but it's a set of examples of the kind of person who qualifies to come into God's tent. Here's the kind of person who can expect to live in security with God. Here's the kind of person who will never be shaken. That is, if you want the security of a right relationship with God, then live this way. How to live? Well, blamelessly, always speaking the truth, never doing anything wrong towards others, and having a genuine sense lived out of justice and righteousness and the honour of God. Well, how do we go? Well, let me suggest there are three approaches to this particular psalm. The first approach really is a kind of shallow, legalistic reading of what we see here. And that is to look at it as a set of rules to be kept, where if you can tick them off and do the bare minimum, then you'll qualify. And that's the sort of attitude that we see in the New Testament that Jesus criticizes among the Pharisees, people who see the law as saying you need to tithe, and they tithe from their mint garden, but they don't seek justice in the way that they treat people. And that kind of Pharisaic hypocrisy is not the way to read this psalm. Another way, and maybe this would be the kind of way that we'd be tended, likely to approach this psalm, is a kind of apathy, thinking, well, maybe the questions don't matter that much, living in the presence of God, who cares too much about that? Well, I want to say it matters seriously. Your eternity hangs on this. And maybe the other approach is a kind of, well, if this is the way it's got to be, I'm just going to work harder, I'm going to grit my teeth, I'm going to turn over a new leaf, I am going to plug myself into making sure I live the most perfect life I possibly can. Well, let me warn you, that's not the way either, because you will fail. No, there's another way to read this psalm, and that is as a mirror. We hold this psalm up to ourselves, and sadly we see how far short we fall. We see that we cannot meet the expectations of being blameless before God. We cannot speak the truth always. We're unable to do things only for the sake of good, only for the sake of the benefit of others. We'll be corrupted, we'll look after our own interests, and we will fail to keep this psalm. See it as a mirror that points out how despairing we really are. We have no hope of being in the presence of God, safe and secure, based on our performance of these things. Held up to us as a mirror, it points out the harsh reality that we have failed. But friends, it's not ultimately a mirror. No, it's more than that, because it is a window to look through. And if you look through the window of this psalm, you will see one who does keep it perfectly. And that is, this is a psalm that works beautifully when applied to Jesus. Here is one whose walk is blameless, who does what's righteous, who speaks the truth from his heart. He doesn't slander, he does no wrong to a neighbour, he doesn't slur other people. Here is Jesus, who actually recognizes that vile people need to be judged and honors those who fear the Lord. Here is one who keeps an oath even when it hurts. Here is one who doesn't change their mind. Jesus is one who treats people with justice, with integrity, with generosity and grace and mercy to the point of giving his life. Friends, when you look to Jesus, you see one who is blameless. You see one who has kept God's word perfectly. You see one who's not he's not failing in this psalm. He's actually fulfilling this psalm. And I take it that we can have a real hope rather than being overwhelmed by our failure. As we look at this, we can look through the psalm to Jesus and see the one who is righteous and blameless, who actually fulfills righteousness for you and for me, and who in dying on a cross and being raised from the dead enables us to come into God's very presence, to find security with God forever, and then by the Spirit of God to actually begin to live out this new life. So friends, Psalm 15 is to point us to Jesus, in whom we find hope, and how we can be transformed by God's word and Spirit.